Welcome back to Sleeping Doze, the place where history drifts in slowly, one forgotten story at a time. Tonight, we begin with something most people have never heard of. A profession that required no tools, no weapons, and no words, just the sky. In the ancient courts of medieval Europe, there were people whose only job was to look up. They were known as cloud interpreters, and believe it or not, kings waited on their words before they went to war. Nobles delayed marriages because of their observations, and peasants would not plant crops until the clouds were red. This is the forgotten history of a job that required stillness, silence, and a very long attention span. So close your eyes, relax your breath, and let's travel back to a time when the sky itself was thought to speak, if only someone could read it. Before weather apps, barometers, or even the word forecast, there were people whose entire lives revolved around clouds. Not farmers, not monks, but a strange class of sky watchers found at the edges of power, quietly observing, recording, and interpreting the moods of the heavens. They were not called meteorologists. In most texts, they are referred to by names like aeromancers, sky readers, or cloud interpreters. In medieval England, they were sometimes simply known as the Watchers. Their job was deceptively simple: watch the clouds and tell the court what they mean. That's it. But behind that simplicity was a deeply respected, and at times feared role, because what they said could delay a royal wedding, it could cancel a treaty, it could even stop an army from marching. In the 12th and 13th centuries, especially during the High Middle Ages, belief in omens, symbols, and divine signs was not considered superstition. It was governance. Rulers consulted sky eaters before battles, when planning royal feasts, or deciding the fate of prisoners. It was believed that the sky could reveal favor or doom, and clouds were the messengers. These were not high priests or nobles. In fact, most cloud interpreters were quiet men from the countryside. They were not educated in universities. Instead, they were often chosen from local regions based on rumor, someone who saw storms before they came, or understood the wind. In places like rural Wales, Brittany, or northern England, village elders would recommend a man who had the eye. That man would be summoned to court, and if his predictions aligned with events, a storm arriving when he said it would, or a fog lingering on a day of mourning, he might be kept. Some courts gave them a small chamber in a high tower or monastery rooftop, where they could observe the skies undisturbed. Their tools, none. No scrolls, no gadgets, just their eyes, their silence, and years of personal cloud lore passed down through generations. They often didn't speak unless asked, and when they did, it was usually short, a sentence, maybe two, but those few words could shake a whole room of armored knights and whispering scribes. In this strange profession, clouds were not just shapes in the sky. They were active participants in fate. There was a full vocabulary of meanings attached to them. Thin white streaks at sunrise, thought to signify betrayal in the court. Low, hanging gray clouds at midday, seen as warnings of spiritual unrest. Circular breaks in the clouds during a royal procession, interpreted as signs of divine approval. A red, hued sky at sunset, said to predict bloodshed within 3 fortnights. Every region had its variations. In the Alps, ring-shaped clouds were believed to represent ancestral spirits watching over travelers. In the flatlands of Denmark, stacked cloud layers were said to signify tension between local clans. The interpretations weren't written down. They were oral and personal. No two cloud interpreters always agreed, but once a court trusted one, his words held. There are preserved records, particularly from French and Italian chronicles, where we find direct mentions of decisions being made based on cloud interpretation. For instance, in 1297, during the planning of a minor invasion by Count Albrecht of Austria, court documents state that the sky gave warning in long wisps the march was delayed. A week later, heavy rains made the roads impassable. The delay, guided by the court sky reader, saved the army weeks of suffering. Similarly, in 1310, a royal wedding in Toulouse was postponed because the sky was layered in mourning. That same night, an accidental fire broke out near the church where the ceremony was to be held. The priest noted, "It seems the watcher was correct. The sky knew what we did not. Despite their influence, cloud interpreters lived solitary lives. Their quarters were usually modest, often attached to a watchtower or the edge of a monastery. They were not celebrated. They rarely dined with nobility. Some were even feared, believed to be half mystics, half cursed. They observed the sky for hours morning to night. Sometimes even through the darkness, they'd look at how clouds caught the moonlight or shifted with nighttime winds. It was a boring job, and that boredom was the job. Their silence gave their words more power. When someone barely speaks, and then suddenly says, "The clouds roll with sorrow," it lands heavier than all the speeches of the court. As Europe entered the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, the profession began to fade. The rise of astronomy, navigation tools, and written weather logs reduced the mysticism around clouds. Cloud interpreters were quietly let go. Some were replaced with natural philosophers. Others simply vanished, gone from records, gone from rooftops, and gone from royal memory. By the 17th century, they were all but forgotten. And yet, for a few centuries, in the hush before a war, or the morning before a crown was placed on a head, a single man stood under the sky, and told the future with clouds, but who taught these men to read the sky? Were their skills passed down or born from solitude, and could it be that they saw patterns we no longer understand? They never left behind books, at least none that have survived. The cloud interpreters of medieval courts lived in silence and left little behind, not even their names in most cases. But if you search carefully through the margins of old monastic manuscripts, estate records, and forgotten chronicles, traces of their presence remain. Faint notes, curious illustrations of swirling clouds, and short mentions in the writings of scribes who were more focused on wars and kings. Still, between the lines, you can feel them, their quiet observers of a sky that spoke only to them. Some evidence does survive. In a 14th century parchment tucked in the Abbey of St. Gall, in what is now Switzerland, a monk recorded the weather each morning for 37 years. But hidden between his careful entries of temperature, wind, and rain are brief notes written in a different hand. Words like spear clouds, dove sky, or morning vapors. No explanation, no elaboration, just phrases. Theories abound that the monk was transcribing observations from a sky eater whose interpretations were considered sacred and not meant to be analyzed, only respected. In the court of King Charles Roman IV of France, a man known only as the Veiled Watcher served for 12 years. No record survives of his origin or training, but he is mentioned consistently in royal memos. Delayed journey, clouds low and broken. Or proceed, Watcher's silence this morning is favorable. His silence, it seems, could be a verdict in itself. At one point, the court records show the king chose to hold off signing a treaty for 3 weeks because the cloud interpreter refused to ascend the tower. That refusal was enough. Negotiations resumed only after he returned to his post. For all their mystery, one cannot help but wonder what exactly these interpreters saw. Were they merely victims of coincidence and ritual, or did their decades of watching the sky give them an intuition that bordered on something real? Some modern meteorologists have tried to replicate old cloud lore. In one small experiment conducted by a weather historian in Wales, rural volunteers were trained to observe clouds using medieval categories: dragon tails, hammer clouds, angel veils. Surprisingly, their predictions about rainfall over a week were only slightly less accurate than modern radar. It seems that looking at the sky every day, for years on end, teaches you something. The symbols used by these interpreters varied widely. Was associated with the death of a noble. More complex interpretations included the direction and texture of the clouds, the time of day they appeared, even how the sun broke through them. Some small guidebooks did exist, passed down by word of mouth or copied by scribes. One such example, known as the Libellus Decales, or Little Book of Skies, survives only in fragments. It was found in a minor cathedral in northern Italy, with symbols that resemble constellations but are clearly clouds layered, twisted, arched. Beside each image is a brief note: if it comes from the west and breaks by noon, take heed, delay the journey. Another says simply, when the sky weeps without thunder, a child of power will fall. These texts were never canonized or made official. They were considered personal, sometimes even heretical. After all, reading the sky bordered on prophecy, and prophecy was dangerous. Many interpreters were quietly dismissed during religious reformations, as churches grew wary of blending natural signs with divine interpretation. Others disappeared after being accused of bringing ill luck, especially if a storm came despite a prediction of clear skies. And yet, for centuries, courts kept them nearby, because even in a world growing more skeptical, their presence provided something more than just prediction. They offered reassurance, a sense that someone was watching, paying attention to the vast and unpredictable world above, that when a decision had to be made, a battle to fight, a path to take it wasn't made blindly. In a court filled with chatter, debates, and shifting alliances, the cloud interpreter was different. He was the quiet one, often cloaked in brown or gray, with no family crest and no official title. He could be seen before sunrise already on the tower, not speaking, not praying, just watching. Sometimes he'd remain there until long after dusk. Other times he wouldn't show up at all, and that absence would speak louder than any omen. There are stories, often half-true, of interpreters vanishing into the mountains, refusing to speak again after seeing a certain cloud pattern, or of one who claimed he saw a sky wound before a royal assassination. Most of these are probably legend, but they reflect the air of reverence and unease that surrounded this role. Their slow disappearance was not marked by a final decree or formal dismissal. Rather, it was a fading. As the Renaissance brought forward astronomers and natural philosophers, as the Enlightenment cast doubt on old intuitions, the cloud interpreters simply became less necessary. Their towers were used for bells, their chambers repurposed. Their names, if anyone remembered them, were removed from court rolls. And still, one wonders what it must have felt like to live that life, to spend every day in stillness, staring into the shifting moods of the sky, waiting for patterns, watching for symbols, knowing that the fate of armies, harvests, and kings might hinge on the silence or presence of a cloud. There is a strange kind of wisdom in that waiting, a patience that few today could summon. And maybe that's why their story remains with us not as heroes or villains, but as watchers, as reminders of a time when looking up could change the course of history. The art of waiting is almost lost today. In a world of instant updates and constant motion, the idea of someone sitting in one spot watching the clouds for hours, for days, for years feels alien, and yet that was the life of the medieval cloud interpreter. His work was not urgent, it could not be rushed. It depended entirely on stillness, on repetition, on the slow accumulation of knowledge that came not from books, but from the sky itself. In a forgotten account from Bohemia, dated 1382, a record notes the presence of a man named Illich, simply described as the Sky Man. He was not listed among the clergy or nobility. His duties were listed as stationed atop the cloister wall, observes daily. His notes, kept in a worn leather pouch found years later, were a mix of drawings and single-line thoughts. One page reads, "Sharp rise," followed by "Drift the army should not go." Another, more cryptic, says, "Doves curled in storm. He will betray." We don't know who he was. Perhaps no one did. But for Illich, like so many of his peers, the clouds were not just weather. They were character, prophecy, intention. The sky had moods, the clouds had emotions, and it was their job to listen. In the royal courts, these interpretations were not always believed, but they were rarely ignored. A ruler might dismiss the warning of a bishop. He might defy the advice of a general, but the words of the cloud interpreter lingered. Perhaps it was the vagueness, the poetic phrasing, or perhaps it was the fear of the unknown, the sense that nature, in all its vastness, had already made a decision. There were also times when a sky reading coincided so precisely with events, it left even the most skeptical stunned. One such account comes from Florence, 1411. On the morning of a trade agreement between rival merchant families, the court's cloud interpreter, a man named Tommaso, observed what he called a mirror break, a rare sky formation that split the clouds into mirrored halves. He told the chancellor, "This sky does not welcome balance." The deal was signed anyway. 3 days later, the families erupted into conflict, ending in what would later be called the Minor Florentine Riots. No one blamed Tommaso, but they never ignored him again. Other interpreters faced a harsher fate. In Prague, a sky reader was accused of treason after predicting mourning over towers the week before the sudden illness of a nobleman's son. He was imprisoned, then vanished from records entirely. His predictions, however, were copied by monks and passed along fragments of sentences written beside notes on lunar phases and harvest yields. The line between science, faith, and fear was thin. To many, these men were not prophets nor scholars. They were something in between. Their wisdom was observational, not divine. Their language was symbolic, but never precise. And that, perhaps, was part of the allure. They didn't offer answers. They offered interpretation, possibility, a space for decision, makers to reflect before acting, a pause built into power, and so they became part of the rhythm of medieval governance. Not central, but always present, a figure in the corner of the courtyard, standing silently in the wind, a shadow on the tower, a sentence whispered just before battle. Even as Europe entered the age of exploration, and thinkers like Galileo and Kepler turned their gaze skyward with mathematical eyes, there were still those who believed in the old ways. Cloud watching did not entirely disappear. It simply changed. It became folklore, then custom, and in time, nothing more than a poetic memory. But in small pockets of Europe, even into the 17th century, there are reports of farmers who delayed planting because the watcher had seen lines in the sky, of travelers who turned back when told, "Today the clouds are quiet, but tomorrow they will shout." Perhaps the last known court-appointed sky eater lived in a small duchy near what is now eastern Germany. His name was Henrik, and he served Duke Wilhelm Roman IV for nearly 20 years. The Duke, a deeply anxious man, relied heavily on Henrik's quiet reports. It's said that Henrik never spoke above a whisper, and when asked what the sky said, would sometimes only raise an eyebrow. When the Duke died, the position was never filled again. Henrik returned to the countryside, where, according to local records, he lived to a great age, still walking every morning to a high hill, just to look. There's something beautiful in that ending. A man who once advised rulers, now alone with the sky. No more armies to warn, no more treaties to sway, just clouds, and the silent dialogue between them, and a man who had spent his life listening. Today, satellite images sweep across our screens in seconds. We know the barometric pressure in every city. We can name cloud types with scientific precision, and yet, despite all our data, weather still surprises us. Storms come earlier than forecasted. Sun breaks through when least expected. Perhaps there is still some mystery up there, something that can't quite be measured, only observed, slowly, quietly. Maybe that's what the cloud interpreters understood. That the sky doesn't speak in facts, it speaks in feelings, in rhythms, in suggestions, and if you listen long enough, with patience, with humility, you might begin to understand. Their names are forgotten. Their towers have crumbled, but for a time they were the ones who looked up when no one else did. And the world, noisy and chaotic below, paused just briefly to hear what the sky had to say. The gong farmer's life in the sewers of Tudor England, the city slept, but the tunnels beneath it did not. By the flickering light of a lantern, a man crouched in the narrow passageway just beneath a public house near Eastcheap. The walls oozed with moisture, and the air was thick with the kind of silence that only centuries of waste could produce. His name was Richard, though no one ever called him that. To most, he was simply the gong man. In Tudor England, the word gong did not mean a bell or an award. It was slang for something far more essential and far less celebrated: human waste. Gong farmers were the men hired to clean out cesspits, latrines, and privies. Their job was to remove the excrement from the stone-lined pits beneath homes and businesses, and haul it bucket by bucket through winding passages to be dumped far outside the city walls. It was quiet work, always done at night. The law even required it between the hours of 9 p.m. and 5 a.m. The Gong farmers emerged carrying wooden tools and wheeled carts. They worked in the shadows so as not to offend the public's eyes or noses. But everyone knew when they'd been nearby. The smell lingered, and so did the unease. Despite this, Gong farming was a respected trade in its own way. It was licensed, regulated, and surprisingly well paid. In some cases, it paid more than a skilled carpenter or a blacksmith. The danger and discomfort of the job earned its price. A good Gong farmer could make enough in a month to buy a hog, or even rent a cottage for the year. But few people envied them. The cesspits themselves were a strange mix of ancient engineering and pure improvisation. In the wealthier homes of London, they were lined with brick or stone, sometimes as deep as 10 or 12 feet. In poorer areas, they were little more than a hole in the ground. When full, they didn't overflow, not immediately. They festered, they bubbled, they announced their readiness through smell, and when the time came, a Gong farmer was summoned. He would arrive quietly, no knocking, no conversation. A local boy might meet him at the back alley with a key or a nod. Then down he went, sometimes alone, sometimes with a younger apprentice. The tools were simple: a long, handled shovel, a bucket, a heavy rope. In some cases, a ladle carved from wood or horn, and always a lantern. They worked knee-deep, sometimes waist-deep in human waste. The gases were dangerous. A single misstep in an unventilated pit could be fatal. Methane buildup could suffocate. In a few recorded cases, the pit actually exploded when a lantern flame ignited the fumes. Death by cesspit was not common, but it was not rare either. And yet, they kept working. Night after night, neighborhood after neighborhood, because the waste didn't stop. It never stopped. By the late 1500s, London's population had ballooned to over 200,000 people. That meant thousands of cesspits, thousands of privies, each one filling slowly every day, and with no underground sewer system. Not yet, the burden fell on the Gong farmers to keep the city breathing. Their waste was not simply discarded. Once hauled to the outskirts, it was sold often to farmers. Night soil, as it was called, was rich in nutrients. Spread across fields, it helped fertilize barley, cabbage, and wheat. In this way, the city's waste became the countryside's bounty. An early, if unintentional, form of recycling. Still, no one wanted to see the men who made that system work. Children were told to look away when a Gong farmer passed. Women crossed the street. Even constables gave them space. Some believed their touch brought illness. Others simply found them revolting. Most pretended they didn't exist. The farmers, for their part, didn't mind. Most preferred the silence. They were used to working when no one else did. They rarely married. Many lived alone or with a small circle of fellow workers. Their homes were on the edge of town near the dumps, the pits, the dark places. But in their own communities, they found a certain pride. They knew that without their work, the city above would rot. And sometimes they saw what others missed: coins lost in the privy, rings that slipped from fingers, even bones, strange ones discarded in haste. In rare cases, their findings ended up in courts, as evidence in trials. One record tells of a small child's shoe found in a cesspit behind a butcher's shop, leading to the arrest of the man who lived above. Another story, told in whispers, speaks of a Gong farmer who uncovered a wrapped bundle of documents sealed with a noble's crest. What became of it is unknown. Their licenses came with rules. They could not begin before 9 p.m. They had to dump their waste at approved sites. They were forbidden to speak of what they saw or found in the pits, and they were not allowed to take apprentices under the age of 14. Still, enforcement was light. Few wanted to police the Gong farmers closely. The smell alone discouraged supervision. The work took its toll. Most did not live to old age. The constant exposure to filth, gas, and infection wore down even the strongest men. Their hands were often cracked, their skin permanently stained, their lungs heavy. Some lost their teeth early, others developed chronic fevers, and yet the demand never lessened. During plague years, their work became even more critical. Privies overflowed, pits filled quickly with the waste of the sick and dying. The city needed them more than ever, but feared them more than ever too. Some were blamed for spreading disease. Others were praised for keeping it at bay. Often both at once, and always when the bells tolled midnight and the streets fell still, the creak of cartwheels could be heard, a faint light flickering down an alley, a figure crouched low, shovel in hand, doing the work no one else dared to do, keeping the city clean, one foul pit at a time. By the late 1500s, as London's population began to swell, the city's waste problem grew with it. Chamber pots were emptied into alleyways and streets, and cesspits, underground vaults that collected human waste, filled more quickly than anyone expected. These pits, dug deep into the soil beneath homes and inns, could become dangerously full, threatening not only comfort but health and safety. And so, when the stench became unbearable or waste began seeping through cellar floors, a call would go out. That call summoned the gong farmers. They usually arrived under cover of night, in dark, quiet hours when streets were empty and the city slept. A cart would roll through alleyways, pulled by a heavy horse, bearing empty barrels, shovels, ropes, and lanterns. Gong farmers, often working in teams of 2 or 3, would descend into the pit. Some pits were reached through hatches in the floor, others through narrow stone shafts outside the house. They wore thick, oiled leather clothing not to protect against the wet, but against disease and parasites. Their hands were calloused, their boots caked in filth, their faces hidden behind rags soaked in vinegar to mask the overwhelming odor, and yet they worked swiftly and without complaint. A full pit could take hours to clear, with each shovelful raised by rope and pulley, dumped into barrels, and sealed for transport. The smell was legendary. It clung to the skin, hair, and clothes. Gong farmers were often forced to live at the edge of town, shunned by polite society despite their importance. Few would sit beside them at church. Inns turned them away. Children pointed and covered their noses. But these men were proud of their work, and they were paid well. A skilled gong farmer could earn 6 pence or more per night, a handsome wage for a commoner. Some even grew wealthy, though they rarely escaped the stigma. Their labor was not only foul but dangerous. The pits sometimes released toxic gases, methane, ammonia, and sulfur that could knock a man unconscious or worse. There were stories of men fainting mid-shovel, slipping under the surface, never to return. Explosions were not unheard of, especially when lanterns sparked gas in the confined chambers. The risk of disease was constant. Typhoid, dysentery, and cholera clung to the edges of every bucket, and yet, night after night, they returned. To basements of taverns, courtyards of manors, and the cellars of crowded London flats. With silent efficiency, they performed their task, leaving no sign behind but the damp earth and the quiet echo of a closing lid. Even the disposal of the waste had its own grim poetry. The barrels were carted beyond city walls to fields known as dung wharves or laystalls, places where the night soil was dumped and later used as fertilizer. There it fed crops that returned to the city's markets, creating a cycle that few wanted to acknowledge. What left the homes as refuse returned as bread, cabbage, and apples. So the gong farmers, unseen and unsung, stood as the quiet engineers of urban life. Without them, cities would have drowned in disease and despair. With them, London breathed a little easier, though it never smelled sweet. As Tudor England marched toward modernity, so too did the systems that surrounded sanitation and urban life. But for much of the 16th and 17th centuries, gong farmers remained essential, yet their presence remained deliberately hidden, much like the filth they removed. In many neighborhoods, local officials maintained secret ledgers of when each cesspit was last emptied. Homeowners were responsible for the maintenance, but few wished to speak openly of it. And so the work was arranged quietly, through backdoor deals and midnight whispers. The gong farmers would arrive without announcement and vanish before the sun rose. Few wanted to meet them, and fewer wanted to know them. They became part of the urban shadow, necessary but never acknowledged. Still, there were rare occasions when the veil lifted. In 1602, a small fire broke out in a London tenement, believed to be sparked by a lantern left near an open cesspit. As the flames spread, neighbors panicked, but it was the gong farmers working that night who acted first. They dropped their tools, used their buckets of night soil to douse the fire, and helped pull children and elderly tenants to safety. The next day, the local magistrate praised their courage. For a brief moment, they were hailed as heroes. But within a week, the praise faded, and the smell returned. Children growing up in London would whisper about the gong farmers' figures who emerged only after midnight, their carts rattling across cobbled stones. Some said they could smell them before they saw them. Others told tales that they lived underground, speaking only in grunts and raising rats as pets. It wasn't true, of course, but such was the way myths grow when society doesn't make room for reality. What most people didn't realize was that some gong farmers had inherited the job. Fathers passed it to sons, who passed it to theirs. Tools were maintained with care, oilcloth coats stitched and repaired, ropes checked each night. It wasn't just work, it was legacy. And while others turned their noses up, these families knew the truth. They kept the city alive. Over time, the gong farmers' routes developed patterns. They knew which homes had the worst pits, which streets had trickling runoff, which corners of the city were dangerous due to slum gangs or narrow alleys. They were night navigators, understanding London's geography more intimately than most. Some spoke several languages. They worked in neighborhoods filled with immigrants, and communication was key to entering homes quietly. They knew how to negotiate, how to barter silence for coin, and how to disappear when trouble brewed. Though they were mocked by many, they were feared by some. Secrets spilled into cesspits, both literal and metaphorical. A hidden bottle, a broken bracelet, even documents that should have never been discarded all passed through their hands. They knew things others didn't. They saw the edges of society, where the poor clung to walls and the wealthy masked their shame. They understood decay, not just of the physical kind, but of dignity, corruption, and denial. As the centuries turned, the work of the gong farmer began to vanish. Modern sewer systems, led by engineers like Sir Joseph Bazalgette in the 1800s, transformed urban waste disposal. Vast underground tunnels replaced cesspits. Flush toilets became common. The need for men with shovels and vinegar. Soaked rags faded, and just like that, the gong farmers were gone. Few gravestones mention them. Few family records boast of their lineage. But the foundations of cities like London were built quite literally on the backs of those who carried away what others left behind. They were the quiet cleaners of history, walking lantern, lit streets while the world slept, making it possible for the rest to awaken in comfort. The coal children of Victorian Britain, they were barely tall enough to reach the handles of the carts they pushed. Some had soot permanently etched into the creases of their hands. In the early dawn hours, before the city stirred, and long after many adults had gone to bed, small feet shuffled down blackened tunnels. They were the coal children of Victorian Britain, forgotten little souls, who kept the empire's hearths warm. In the booming days of the Industrial Revolution, coal was king. It powered the new machines, fed the great locomotives, and warmed every drawing room and factory floor. But behind the elegant facades of Victorian progress were the children who dug, hauled, and choked beneath the earth to keep the wheels of empire turning. In mining villages across Yorkshire, Wales, and northern England, children as young as 5 or 6 began their days before the sun rose. Their meals, if they had any, were simple: a hunk of bread, a cold cup of tea. Their clothes hung loose on their thin frames, patched and handed down from older siblings. Their eyes, often dull from exhaustion, carried years far beyond their age. Most were born into mining families. If your father worked in the pit, so would you. School was a luxury. Time was survival. The mind didn't wait for education. Boys often became trappers. Their job was to sit alone for hours in total darkness, opening and closing small wooden doors that controlled airflow in the tunnels. They were paid a few pennies a week. Girls hauled coal in baskets strapped to their backs. Some crawled on all fours, dragging loads nearly their own weight through cramped, jagged passageways. The darkness was absolute. There were no lights in the deeper shafts, except for the flickering flame of a small oil lamp. Children learned to navigate the tunnels by touch. The air was thick with coal dust, sometimes so dense it felt like breathing through cloth. Coughs became constant companions. So did injuries, scrapes from falling rocks, crushed fingers, broken limbs, and worse. In 1842, the British government conducted a commission to investigate working conditions in the mines. The findings shocked even the hardened politicians of the time. Testimonies revealed little girls working bare-chested in hot tunnels, boys sleeping beside rats, and children dying of exhaustion. One account described a 6-year-old girl who had worked underground for 12 hours a day, every day, since she was 3. She thought the sun only came out on Sundays, and yet, despite public outcry, change came slowly. Families depended on the pennies their children earned. Without them, there would be no bread, no roof, no coal for their own hearth. Some mothers cried as their children left for the mines each morning, but hunger was a louder voice than pity. And for many, the mine was all they had ever known, not a place of horror, but of routine, community, even pride. Among these children, stories grew. They created nicknames for tunnels, invented games in the dark, and sang songs to keep their minds from drifting into fear. Older children looked after the younger ones, passing down tips on how to listen for danger, the groan of shifting rock, the subtle change in air pressure. They knew how to read the earth better than any textbook could teach. And then there were the moments of silence. Deep underground, away from the clamor above, there was a strange peace in the blackness. Some children found comfort in the quiet, a stillness that wrapped around them like a blanket. But for others, it was a reminder of their isolation, a reminder that the world had forgotten them, even as it depended entirely on their unseen labor. By the mid-19th century, the voices of reformers began to reach the ears of Parliament. The 1842 Children's Employment Commission, prompted by harrowing testimonies, sparked the first real national debate on child labor in mines. One by one, newspapers published the words of little boys and girls, some barely able to speak, describing pitch-black tunnels, brutal overseers, and days so long that night meant nothing. It was the image of Sarah Gooder, an 8-year-old girl who told investigators that she was scared in the dark but used to it now. That shook many to their core. Her words weren't angry, they weren't dramatic. They were simply tired, the voice of someone whose childhood had been worn away by the daily grind of survival. The Mines Act of 1842 followed. It prohibited the employment of women and girls underground and banned boys under 10 from mine work. It was a step forward, but not a full rescue. Many families simply lied about their children's ages or sent them to unofficial roles not covered by the law. Enforcement was thin, and the need for income stronger than any statute. So, children kept working. Now they did so in slightly better lighting, with marginally more attention paid to their safety. But for the most part, they remained beneath the earth, growing up in silence, surrounded by coal walls and dust that settled into their lungs and stayed there for life. Still, the seeds of change had been planted. Religious groups, abolitionists, and humanitarians began to view child labor not just as an economic issue, but a moral one. Illustrated pamphlets depicted gaunt children pushing overloaded wagons. Sermons spoke of God's little ones, condemned to darkness. Schools for the poor began to appear, often led by women volunteers, determined to bring a candle of light into lives that knew only shadow. Some mine owners, pressured by public attention, began to invest in alternatives. They introduced mechanical hauling systems to replace child pullers. Others, resentful of interference, simply moved operations to rural areas where inspection was less likely. The tug-of war between profit and protection had begun. Through all this, the children themselves carried on. They learned to sleep with one eye open. Some died young, coughing up blood in their teens. Others made it into adulthood, their spines curved from years of crawling, their hearing dulled by constant echo. Many never spoke of the tunnels again. It was too heavy a memory to share. Yet a strange pride remained in some of them. In old age, those who had once worked the coal pits often described their childhoods not with bitterness, but with resilience. "We were strong," one former miner wrote in a letter decades later. "We didn't break." There was truth in that. They were not just victims, they were survivors. They built a foundation for future generations, laying down the bricks of reform with their own pain. Their suffering stirred hearts and changed laws. Because of them, the world began to ask, what does a child deserve? It would take many more decades and many more reforms before the last child left the coal mine. But the shift had begun. With every story told, every law passed, every photo shared, the darkness receded just a little. And still, beneath modern Britain, the tunnels remain, silent now, empty, a reminder carved in stone and soot, a quiet graveyard for the stolen childhoods of the coal children. Today, when we visit museums or heritage sites about coal mining, we often see the tools: pickaxes, lanterns, carts. We hear the sound effects of hammers clinking and men shouting over the rumble of carts. But what we don't always hear are the small voices. We don't hear the soft cough of a child who hasn't seen daylight in weeks. We don't hear the quiet sob of a girl whose dress is torn from crawling through sharp stone. We don't hear the whispered songs boys sang to themselves in the dark just to keep fear at bay. These were the sounds that filled the real tunnels. Not heroism, not adventure, just endurance. Some of these tunnels still exist, sealed now cold, abandoned arteries of a bygone industry. In a few preserved mines open to visitors, you can descend into those narrow shafts. Even with modern lighting and safety gear, it feels suffocating, the air is damp, the stone presses close on all sides, and suddenly you understand this was not a job for a child, it was a sentence. Yet many families at the time didn't have a choice. A father injured in a shaft collapse, a mother with 6 mouths to feed, wages were low, and food was dear. If a child could bring in even a few pennies a week, it meant bread instead of hunger. So the choice was made not out of cruelty, but survival. It was a grim economy of necessity. Still, the toll was permanent. Thousands of children emerged from the mines with their growth stunted, backs twisted, lungs damaged. Many never lived to 30. Those who did carried the mine inside them, the memory, the scars, the silence. Their eyes had adjusted to darkness, not just physically, but emotionally. It was hard to look at the world with hope when your childhood had been spent underground. But slowly, society changed. Newspapers gave space to stories that once went untold. Writers and artists began to depict these children not as statistics, but as human beings. Charles Dickens, among others, used his pen to shine light where governments had turned a blind eye. Public sympathy grew, and with sympathy came action. More mines were inspected, more schools were built, reform laws were strengthened and enforced, employers were fined, and over time, the idea that a child should be educated instead of exploited became not just a moral cause, but a national value. Today, children in Britain no longer crawl through mines. They walk to classrooms. They play in parks. They imagine futures that aren't bound by soot and stone. And yet, the legacy of the coal children remains. It lingers in the foundations of labor laws, in the very idea that work should never steal childhood. Their suffering didn't end with them. It changed the world, and sometimes that is the quiet power of a child, not in what they say, or even what they do, but in what their story awakens in others. That's why we remember the coal children. Not to pity them, but to honor them, and to make sure no child ever again is asked to trade sunshine for darkness. The man who cleaned the Roman sewers, Marcus, was not a soldier. He didn't wear a laurel crown or debate in marble halls. He was a cleaner, a clocarius, one of the many nameless laborers tasked with keeping the Roman sewers running day and night. He worked beneath the shining streets of Rome in its vast and ancient sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, a marvel of engineering and a world entirely its own. The tunnels echoed with centuries of filth, secrets, and discarded history. Most Romans above never thought about the sewers except when something went wrong, but Marcus thought of little else. He descended each day with a long pole, a flickering torch, and a simple scarf wrapped around his mouth to guard against the stench. Rats scurried around him, the walls sweated, the water, black and slow, carried everything the city didn't want: excrement, waste, blood from the arenas, even the remains of unwanted infants. It was all part of the underworld Marcus called home. But Marcus saw beauty in the rot, the way runoff from the forum trickled past ancient stones, the strange, broken trinkets that washed down from the rich district's rings, combs, bits of pottery. He collected these small lost things, cleaned them, and lined them on a narrow shelf in his modest home. His wife joked that he was curating Rome's forgotten museum. What no one above understood was that the city's grandeur stood atop the work of men like him. When the baths overflowed or the fountains slowed, they called in engineers, but the engineers could only work because Marcus had already mapped every curve and blockage of the sewer like the back of his hand. One autumn, the Cloaca began backing up badly. The eastern branch clogged so deep it threatened the drains in the temple of Vesta. Senators panicked. Priests feared a bad omen. It smelled like the wrath of the gods. But to Marcus, it smelled like a collapsed culvert. He crawled farther than he ever had before, past cracked vaults and tunnels no one had entered in generations. In one chamber, beneath a broken aqueduct, he found a section where an old tree root had slowly burst the brick lining, allowing rubble to fall and clog the flow entirely. He cleared it by hand. Stone by stone, it took days. When the water finally roared through again, the entire system breathed. Fountains sang, baths warmed, priests offered thanks to Jupiter, senators praised the engineers. But down below, in the cold, wet dark, Marcus just leaned against the wall and exhaled. Titus woke before the sun, his feet calloused from decades of damp tunnels. The Roman sewers, the Cloaca Maxima, were vast and winding beneath the city, a world of shadows, echoes, and stench. No senator ever descended into those depths. No noble ever thanked the men who kept Rome from drowning in its own waste. But Titus, he knew every corner. Torch in hand, he would descend the stone steps into the dark, humming old soldiers' songs as rats skittered and water gurgled. With his iron rake and oil-soaked rags, he dislodged clogs, cleared debris, and scrubbed the walls where filth had hardened like plaster. Some days, when the rains came, the tunnels swelled with rushing black water. Titus had learned how to brace himself in alcoves, how to breathe through a soaked cloth, how to survive when the city above celebrated festivals and victories, utterly unaware of the flood that almost was. Other cleaners came and went. Some couldn't handle the smell. Others feared the darkness, the occasional vins, or the sickness that crept into their lungs. But Titus remained. He said little, worked much, and returned home with cracked hands and tired knees. In the taverns above, people gossiped of emperors, gladiators, and foreign wars. No one spoke of sewermen, but they relied on them. Every bathhouse drained into the system Titus maintained, every kitchen, every latrine. Even the aqueduct's runoff flowed down there. He saw things no one else did. Once, he found the body of a runaway slave in the current. Another time, he discovered gold coins, dozens of them, spilled through a kitchen grate above. He left them there, said it wasn't his to take. That's who he was. And though he walked alone, hunched and unnoticed, Rome never thanked Titus, but it stood clean, unwrecked, functioning because of him. One evening, as winter winds whistled through the marble arches of Rome, a great commotion stirred in the city center. The forum's drains had backed up. Water pooled around senators' feet. Foulness gurgled up through the grates near the temple of Saturn. The marble plazas stank, and the cause was unknown. Officials panicked. Slaves with buckets couldn't fix it. Architects scratched their heads. Even the high priest demanded the gods be appeased, but prayers did nothing to clear the flow. That's when an older engineer mentioned a name. Quietly, as if ashamed that the empire's pride depended on such a man. Titus, the sewer man. By torchlight and torchbearer, they found him, squatting by a runoff stream, mending a broken rake. He didn't speak much when they begged his help. He simply stood, tied his belt, and followed them. With no ceremony and no praise, Titus descended into the sewers alone. He carried only his tools and a gut-born map etched into memory. He waded through chest, high water, climbed over fallen bricks, and crawled where tunnels narrowed into slits. Hours passed. Above, Rome held its breath. Senators peered from balconies. Slaves whispered of curses. Then, without warning, the drains cleared, water gushed, fountains flowed, the city breathed again. Titus emerged before dawn, soaked, shivering, coated in grime. He said nothing, just nodded once to the engineer and walked home. That day, a senator declared the event a miracle. A scribe recorded that the gods had been appeased. No one mentioned Titus, but the engineer, that quiet man who remembered him, had something carved, a small plaque in a corner no noble would ever notice, near the mouth of the Cloaca Maxima. It read, "To the one who walked where others would not, and kept Rome alive, Titus, the unseen." And in that silence, beneath the city, the true weight of civilization rested not on marble or gold, but on the shoulders of an old man who cleaned the sewers. The girl who faced the Viking invasion, she was barely 13 when the ships came. Longboats with carved dragon heads sliced through the mist along the eastern shores of what is now modern-day England. To some, they looked like monsters rising from the sea, but to Evelyn, a young girl from a coastal village in Northumbria, they meant only one thing: danger. The year was 793, and the first major Viking raid on Lindisfarne had just shocked the Christian world. The coasts trembled under the threat of Norsemen warriors who did not come to trade or to talk, but to take, to burn, to plunder. Evelyn's village lay only a few miles inland from a known landing point. Her father was gone, one of the many men conscripted months earlier to guard monasteries up the coast. That left her mother, 2 younger brothers, and Evelyn herself to prepare for what they all feared was coming. In those days, girls were taught to spin wool, grind grain, and tend the hearth. But Evelyn's mother had been raised in harsher times. She believed in teaching her daughter how to fire, harden a spear, how to signal allies with smoke, how to listen for the difference between silence and ambush. So when the village scout came running down the road, breathless and pale, shouting that the sea-born men had landed only hours away, it was not panic that filled Evelyn's chest, it was readiness. The village elders told the women and children to flee, to scatter into the woods and boglands where the raiders might not follow. But Evelyn stayed behind, not because she was brave, but because her brother was ill with fever and her mother couldn't carry both boys. So she told them to run, and she stayed. She took what she could carry: smoked fish, a skin of water, a flint knife, and the small wooden cross her father had carved years before. Then she waited. The raid came at dawn. Smoke curled up before the screaming reached her ears. She crouched beneath a root cellar, clutching the knife until her fingers turned white. Hours passed, footsteps above, voices in a language like thunder. But they never found her. That night, when the fire had died down and only cinders smoldered, she emerged to a blackened village, homes burned, livestock gone, sacred relics smashed. But among the ruins, she found something the Vikings had missed: an old pack horse, spooked but alive, still tied near the edge of the woods. Evelyn took it and began to walk. For 3 days she followed the woodland paths, sleeping in hollows, drinking from streams. When she finally reached the village where her family had fled, her face was covered in ash, her lips cracked, her voice silent. Her mother wept to see her alive. That girl would grow into a woman who told few stories of the raid. But she became known for teaching every child in her village, boys and girls, how to signal with fire, how to ride in silence, how to hear the forest breathe. And in the decades to come, when more raids would come, it was often the villages trained by her, fortified by her story, that escaped with their lives. Evelyn never saw her father again, but she became, in her own quiet way, a shield. Not with sword or violence, but with knowledge. And sometimes that's the most powerful armor of all. Years passed. The scars of that morning never quite left Evelyn. though she rarely spoke of them. Some said she became hard a girl grown old too fast, but those who knew her best saw something else: vigilance. In the years after the attack, Viking raids became more frequent. Villages across the coast lived under a constant veil of dread. But Eadlin's small community began to shift because of her. She taught children how to interpret the sky, how to recognize the strange gulls that followed the Norse ships. She taught mothers how to store food underground, out of sight. She trained young boys not in swordplay, but in alertness, the discipline of knowing when to speak, and when silence could save lives. People began to listen. At 16, she organized the building of hidden shelters throughout the forest, crude but clever, lined with moss and stone. At 17, she was advising elders on watch rotations and escape routes. She never claimed leadership. She simply acted, quietly, constantly, and when another raid did come, this time by a smaller group of Vikings testing the inland trails, it was Eadlin who saw the smoke first. She rang the warning bell, gathered the children, and guided her people to the shelters she had helped build. This time, no one died. The raiders found an empty village. They torched homes, yes, stole what little livestock hadn't been hidden, but they found no slaves to take. No easy victims. When the villagers returned, they mourned what was lost, but they also celebrated what had been preserved. Life, word spread. Other nearby hamlets began sending their daughters to learn from Eadlin. Not to wield weapons, but to observe, to track, to prepare. Her quiet defiance against the invaders became a model not of vengeance, but of survival. And in a world where chaos often rewarded cruelty, her story whispered a different kind of courage, one that endures. Years later, long after the raids began to fade and the Viking threat lost its edge, Eadlin still walked the edge of the forest every morning, not out of fear anymore, but habit and maybe reverence. The forest had saved them, and she never forgot. By then, she was no longer just a girl who had survived. She had become a living legend, though you'd never hear her say so. The children of her village, many of them now grown, had passed her teachings to their own. They remembered her not just as the girl who had raised the warning bell, but as the one who never let grief harden into bitterness, who turned survival into a shared act of resilience. One winter evening, a rider arrived with news from the coast. The last of the known Viking ships had retreated. The kingdom had strengthened its borders. Peace, true peace, was finally settling like snow on the hills. Eadlin sat by the fire that night, not speaking much. Her hands, always busy, slowly spun flax into thread. She didn't weep. She didn't smile. But for the first time in years, she let the thread fall from her fingers and just sat still. The people of the village wanted to hold a feast in her honor. She declined. Feasts are for the living, she said, not the watching. She had never sought to be seen. She had simply refused to be erased. By the time she passed quietly, in her sleep, with no signs of suffering, her story had already moved beyond her village. Wandering monks told her tale in abbeys far south. Traders recited her name alongside kings and battles. But those who truly remembered her didn't speak of glory. They spoke of the way she taught them to listen to the wind, to hide without shame, to protect without violence, to endure even when the world didn't care. Eadlin didn't defeat the Vikings. She outlasted them, and perhaps in the end that was the greater victory.